2 weeks after I moved my son's entire fortune to offshore accounts, my daughter-in-law walked into that lawyer's office expecting to take half of everything. Instead, she found empty bank statements and a truth that would destroy her world forever. But what she didn't know, what nobody knew, was that I'd been watching her for months. And the reason why will haunt you until the very end of this story. If you've ever wondered how far a father would go to protect his child, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you thought you knew about family loyalty. And trust me, you'll want to remember this channel when you see how this nightmare finally ends. My name is Eugene Castellano, and I'm 73 years old. The lines on my face tell the story of 5 decades building an empire from nothing. Every sleepless night, every impossible decision, every victory and betrayal carved into the weathered skin around my eyes. I built my first business with nothing but borrowed money and calloused hands when I was 22, working 18-hour days in a cramped warehouse that smelled of motor oil and broken dreams. Today, I control a network of companies worth more than most people see in 10 lifetimes. My signature on documents that move millions of dollars with a stroke of expensive ink. But all that money, all that power, all those years of sacrifice couldn't prepare me for what I discovered about the woman my son married. The revelation came slowly, like cancer spreading through healthy tissue, each new piece of evidence more disturbing than the last until the full scope of her deception finally became clear. And when it did, when I finally understood the depth of evil that had entered my family disguised as love, I realized that everything I'd built, everything I'd worked for, everything I held sacred was under attack by an enemy more dangerous than any business rival I'd ever faced. You have to understand something about my boy Dominic. He's brilliant. Graduated summa cum laude from Wharton with a mind that can dissect complex financial instruments like a master surgeon separating healthy tissue from diseased. He speaks 4 languages fluently, reads voraciously, can predict market trends with an intuition that borders on supernatural. When he walks into a boardroom, grown men twice his age defer to his expertise. But when it comes to reading people, when it comes to seeing the darkness that can live inside someone's heart, camouflaged behind a beautiful smile and intelligent conversation, my son was born blind to evil. Maybe that's my fault. Maybe I protected him too much, shielded him from the harsh realities of how cruel the world can be to those who have something worth taking. Maybe I gave him too much, too easily. Let him grow up in a bubble where kindness was rewarded and trust was never betrayed. Maybe I raised him to believe that the world was full of good people with good intentions, never imagining that predators could be so sophisticated, so patient, so utterly convincing in their performances. Melissa entered our lives like a spring rain after a devastating drought, bringing with her the promise of renewal and growth and happiness. Beautiful, of course. Long auburn hair that caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows of our Connecticut estate, transforming ordinary moments into something that belonged in a Renaissance painting. Green eyes that seemed to hold secrets, depths that promised mystery and intelligence and passion. A smile that could melt glacier ice, warming rooms simply by existing within them. But it wasn't just her physical beauty that captivated Dom, though God knows that would have been enough for most men his age. She was smart in ways that mattered to him, articulate about subjects he cared about, knowledgeable about global economics and environmental policy and emerging technologies. She came from what appeared to be a respectable middle-class family, had carved out her own successful career as a marketing director for a mid-sized firm, maintained her own apartment in a decent neighborhood, drove her own car, lived her own life. She didn't seem needy or desperate or obviously mercenary. She seemed independent, accomplished, genuinely interested in building something meaningful with my son. She seemed perfect. Too perfect. I've learned to trust my instincts over 7 decades of living, and something about Melissa set off alarm bells from the very beginning. Not obvious red flags, nothing I could point to and say definitively was wrong. Just a subtle wrongness, like a photograph that looks normal at first glance but reveals unsettling details the longer you study it. They met at a charity gala I'd dragged Dom to. One of those tedious affairs where wealthy people in expensive clothes write checks to worthy causes so they can feel better about being wealthy. The ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was filled with the usual suspects. Old money families trying to maintain relevance, new money families trying to buy respectability, politicians and socialites and business leaders all performing their assigned roles in New York's intricate social theater. I was nursing a scotch that cost more than most people's weekly salary, half listening to a pharmaceutical executive complain about FDA regulations, when I spotted her across the crowded room. She was standing near the silent auction displays, studying a collection of vintage wine bottles with the focused attention of someone who either knew a great deal about wine or was very good at pretending she did. What caught my attention wasn't her beauty. Beautiful women were hardly uncommon at these events. It was the way she moved, the way she positioned herself, the way she seemed to be constantly aware of everyone around her while appearing completely absorbed in whatever she was looking at. She was hunting, though for what I couldn't yet say. I watched from my position by the bar as she approached Dom, who was standing alone near the buffet table, probably checking his phone and wishing he was anywhere else. She didn't make a direct approach. Too obvious. Instead, she positioned herself nearby, close enough that when Dom finally looked up from his device, he couldn't help but notice her. What followed was a masterclass in manipulation, disguised as chance encounter. She asked him about the wine collection she'd been studying, claiming she was thinking of bidding but wasn't sure if the 1982 Bordeaux was actually worth the estimated value. It was exactly the kind of sophisticated question designed to engage someone like Dom, complex enough to demonstrate intelligence, specific enough to suggest genuine interest, open-ended enough to encourage extended conversation. Dom, who had inherited his grandmother's passion for wine collecting along with her extensive cellar, was immediately hooked. I watched them talk for 20 minutes, watched her laugh at his jokes with timing that seemed just slightly too perfect, watched her ask follow-up questions that demonstrated she was not only listening, but actually understanding complex concepts about vintage analysis and market valuation. The conversation flowed naturally from wine to art to sustainable investment strategies, hitting every topic that Dom found intellectually stimulating. By the time the evening ended, they'd exchanged business cards and made plans to continue their discussion over dinner the following weekend. Dom came home that night with an energy I hadn't seen in months, talking animatedly about this incredible woman he'd met. He described her intelligence, her sophistication, her apparent passion for environmental causes and social responsibility. How she'd actually challenged some of his ideas about renewable energy investments, suggesting alternative approaches he hadn't considered. How she'd listened, really listened, when he talked about his work, asking questions that showed she understood the nuances of complex financial structures. How she'd made him feel heard and appreciated and intellectually stimulated in ways he'd never experienced before. Red flag number 1. She was too good to be true. In 5 decades of business, I've learned that when something appears perfect, it usually means someone has invested considerable time and effort in making it appear that way. Red flag number 2. She knew too much. The questions she'd asked, the observations she'd made, the level of sophistication she'd demonstrated, these weren't the casual interests of someone who'd stumbled into conversation. They were the carefully prepared talking points of someone who'd done extensive research. But Dom was smitten, and confronting him directly would have been counterproductive. I'd made that mistake years earlier with his older brother Vincent, who'd gotten involved with a woman I knew was trouble. When I'd tried to intervene forcefully, presenting evidence of her questionable past and manipulative behavior, Vincent had chosen her over family. It had taken 3 years and a devastating betrayal before he'd finally seen the truth, and by then the damage to our relationship had been severe. I couldn't risk losing Dom the same way. So I decided to watch, to wait, to gather information quietly, while hoping that time would reveal Melissa's true nature before any permanent damage was done. Over the next 6 months, I observed their relationship develop with the careful attention of a scientist studying a potentially dangerous phenomenon. Dom fell deeper in love with each passing week, while Melissa played her role with a consistency that would have impressed professional actors. She was supportive but not clingy, giving Dom space to maintain his independence while always being available when he needed emotional support. She was interested in his wealth, but not obviously so, asking thoughtful questions about his business interests without ever directly inquiring about his net worth or inheritance prospects. She was independent but not distant, maintaining her own career and social circle while gradually integrating herself into Dom's life and family. She remembered details about conversations they'd had weeks earlier, demonstrated genuine interest in his hobbies and passions, and somehow always knew exactly what to say to make him feel valued and understood. It was a flawless performance, and that's exactly what worried me. During family dinners at our estate, I watched her interact with each family member with laser-focused attention to their individual personalities and interests. With Dom's sister Sophia, she was the fun, slightly rebellious older sister type, sharing stories about her supposed college adventures and offering advice about boys and fashion. With my wife Margaret, she was respectful and deferential, asking for cooking tips and expressing genuine admiration for the antique furniture and art pieces Margaret had collected over the decades. With me, she was the perfect daughter-in-law candidate, intelligent enough to engage in serious conversation, respectful enough to acknowledge my experience and accomplishments, charming enough to win over even my most skeptical instincts. She asked thoughtful questions about the family business, expressed interest in our charitable foundations, and somehow always struck exactly the right balance between curiosity and propriety. She was good. Damn good. So good that even I began to question my initial suspicions, wondering if I was simply being paranoid or overprotective. Then came the dinner conversation that changed everything. It was a crisp October evening, about 8 months after Dom and Melissa had started dating. We were gathered in our formal dining room, the one with the hand-painted Italian ceiling and the chandelier that had once hung in a Venetian palace. Margaret had prepared her famous osso buco, and the conversation had naturally drifted to business as Dom discussed his latest renewable energy investments. The project was ambitious, a series of solar farms across 3 southwestern states, designed to provide clean energy to rural communities while generating substantial returns for investors. Dom was passionate about the environmental benefits, but he was also excited about the financial opportunities, describing the complex web of tax incentives and federal subsidies that made such projects profitable. As he talked, I noticed Melissa listening with an intensity that went beyond polite interest. She asked detailed questions about energy storage technologies, about grid integration challenges, about the political stability of the regions where the farms would be located. Her questions were sophisticated, the kind that required deep knowledge of both technical and financial aspects of large-scale energy projects. Then she made a casual observation that stopped my heart. "Have you considered diversifying into rare earth mining operations in Africa?" she asked, cutting her meat with elegant precision. "The demand for lithium and cobalt is going to explode over the next decade as electric vehicle adoption accelerates. Getting in early on mining operations in politically stable regions could provide incredible returns, especially if you can establish relationships with processing facilities in Southeast Asia." It was a brilliant observation, demonstrating understanding of global supply chains, geopolitical risk assessment, and long-term market trends. The kind of sophisticated investment strategy that required years of experience and access to high-level industry intelligence. There was just one problem. It was exactly the investment strategy I'd been developing in secret for my own portfolio, working with a small team of specialized consultants over the past 6 months. The research was highly confidential, the kind of proprietary intelligence that gave wealthy investors decisive advantages over their competitors. I'd never discussed it with anyone outside my inner circle of trusted advisors, and Dom certainly didn't know about it. So how did Melissa know? I maintained my composure through the rest of dinner, but inside my mind was racing through possibilities. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe she'd reached the same conclusions independently. Or maybe she'd read similar analysis in some financial publication I'd missed. Maybe I was overthinking an innocent comment. but my instincts were screaming that this was no coincidence. After dinner, I excused myself and went to my study, a oak-paneled sanctuary lined with first-edition books and filled with the accumulated wisdom of 5 decades in business. For the next 4 hours, I made phone calls to people who owed me favors, who had access to information that most people couldn't obtain, who moved in the shadowy spaces between legitimate business and something darker. By dawn, I had a name. Melissa Jane Hartford, originally Melissa Jane Kowalski, from Scranton, Pennsylvania. The elegant, educated marketing director was a carefully constructed fiction. The real Melissa had no college degree, despite claiming to have graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern. The marketing director position she claimed to hold? The company had never heard of her. The sophisticated apartment she lived in? Rented under a false name with 6 months' rent paid in advance with cash. But the most disturbing discovery was her romantic history. 3 previous relationships with wealthy men over the past 8 years. All had ended in expensive divorce settlements. All had been preceded by the men's families experiencing mysterious financial difficulties that necessitated liquidating assets and restructuring investments. My daughter-in-law wasn't just a gold digger taking advantage of my son's trusting nature. She was a professional, part of a sophisticated operation that targeted wealthy families with surgical precision. The evidence was overwhelming, but I faced the same dilemma I'd confronted years earlier with Vincent. Presenting Dom with proof of Melissa's deception would likely backfire, driving him deeper into her arms and further away from family. I needed a different approach, something more subtle, more strategic. I decided to become a student of my enemy, to learn her methods and motivations while she remained unaware that I'd discovered her true nature. If Melissa wanted to play games with the Castellano family fortune, we'd play games. But we'd play by my rules. The engagement was announced 6 months later at a lavish party in our Hamptons estate. 200 guests sipped champagne that cost more per bottle than most people earned in a week, while a string quartet flown in from Vienna provided musical accompaniment to what everyone believed was a celebration of true love. Melissa wore a cream-colored designer dress that had probably cost more than a luxury car, her auburn hair arranged in an elaborate updo that showcased diamond earrings that caught the evening light like captured stars. She moved through the crowd with practiced grace, accepting congratulations with exactly the right mixture of joy and humility, playing the role of the blushing bride-to-be with Academy Award-worthy skill. I watched her work the room that night with the fascination of a naturalist observing a particularly dangerous predator in its natural habitat. She remembered every guest's name, inquired about their children and businesses and health concerns with apparent genuine interest. She was mapping our social and professional networks, cataloging relationships and influences and potential vulnerabilities. Every conversation was reconnaissance, every smile a weapon in an arsenal I was only beginning to understand. But what truly chilled me was watching her cultivate her relationship with Dom's younger sister, Sophia. Sophie was 19 then, home from Yale for summer break, brilliant but naive in the way that only sheltered young people can be. Melissa befriended her immediately, becoming the older sister Sophie had never had but always wanted. They went shopping together in Soho, spending afternoons browsing boutiques that sold clothes worth more than some people's annual salaries. They had lunch dates at trendy restaurants, sharing secrets and gossip and dreams over meals that cost hundreds of dollars. They attended Broadway shows and art gallery openings, cultural events that allowed Melissa to further establish her sophistication and taste. Through Sophie, Melissa gained access to family information that no outsider should have possessed. She learned about Dom's inheritance timeline, the trust structures that would give him controlling interest in 3 major companies when he turned 35. She discovered the locations of our family's safety deposit boxes and safety deposit boxes, information that was supposed to be restricted to immediate family members. She even learned about my private health concerns, issues I'd kept confidential even from most of my business partners. Most disturbingly, she used Sophie as an unwitting source of intelligence about our family's relationships and potential vulnerabilities. Through casual conversations, she learned which relatives might be resentful about inheritance distributions, which business partners might harbor grudges, which employees might be susceptible to recruitment for industrial espionage. Sophie trusted Melissa completely, never imagining that her new sister-in-law was systematically extracting information that could be weaponized against our family. And Melissa repaid that trust by treating Sophie with genuine affection and care, making the manipulation even more sinister because it was wrapped in what appeared to be authentic, sisterly love. The wedding was scheduled for the following spring, and as the months passed, I continued my investigation while documenting Melissa's activities with the methodical thoroughness of a prosecutor building a criminal case. I hired the best private investigators money could buy, former FBI agents and CIA operatives who specialized in corporate espionage and personal security. What they discovered painted a picture of calculated predation that spanned more than a decade. Melissa had been systematically targeting wealthy men since she was 22 years old, refining her methods with each relationship, learning from her mistakes, becoming increasingly sophisticated in her approach. Her previous victims had been chosen carefully, men who were wealthy but isolated, who had strained relationships with their families or limited social support networks, men who were lonely, insecure, or recently divorced, men who could be manipulated through emotional vulnerability rather than just physical attraction. But Dom represented a significant escalation in her targeting profile. He was younger, more attractive, and far wealthier than her previous marks. More importantly, he was part of a close-knit family with extensive business and political connections. Taking him down would require more sophisticated planning and execution than anything she'd attempted before. The most damning evidence came 3 weeks before the wedding, when one of my investigators followed Melissa to a meeting with Harrison Mitchell, one of New York's most ruthless divorce attorneys. Mitchell was known for his scorched earth tactics, his ability to uncover hidden assets, and his willingness to use any legal or quasi-legal method to maximize his clients' settlements. They met at Le Bernardin, one of the most expensive restaurants in Manhattan, surrounded by other wealthy diners who were too absorbed in their own conversations to pay attention to the woman and lawyer huddled over documents at a corner table. The meeting lasted 2 hours, and though my investigator couldn't hear their conversation from his position across the restaurant, he managed to photograph several documents being passed between them. Documents that looked very much like preliminary divorce papers, complete with asset inventories and settlement demands. Melissa wasn't just planning to marry Dom and then divorce him for half his wealth. She was planning the divorce before the wedding had even taken place, mapping out her exit strategy with military precision while pretending to be madly in love with my son. The wedding took place on a perfect May afternoon that seemed designed by Hollywood set decorators to showcase the beauty of our Connecticut estate. 350 guests witnessed the ceremony in our formal gardens, where flowers that cost more than most people's cars created a backdrop of almost supernatural beauty. Dom had never looked happier, standing at the altar in a custom-tailored tuxedo that emphasized his tall, athletic build and genuine smile. He radiated joy and contentment and absolute confidence in his choice, completely unaware that the woman walking down the aisle toward him was already planning his destruction. Melissa was radiant in her wedding gown, a creation of silk and lace and hand-sewn pearls that had taken a team of designers 6 months to complete. She moved with ethereal grace, her face glowing with what appeared to be transcendent happiness, tears of joy glistening in her green eyes as she approached the man she was about to promise to love and honor for the rest of their lives. The ceremony was perfect in every detail, from the string quartet's rendition of classical masterpieces to the priest's eloquent homily about the sacred nature of marriage and the importance of trust and honesty in building a life together. When Dom and Melissa exchanged vows, promising to love and protect each other through good times and bad, there wasn't a dry eye among the assembled guests. As Melissa's stand-in father, her own father being conveniently absent due to what she claimed was a sudden illness, I had the honor of walking her down the aisle. As we made our way across the manicured lawn, she squeezed my arm and whispered in a voice thick with emotion how grateful she was to be joining our family, how she would love Dom with all her heart until the day she died, how she would do everything in her power to make him happy. Standing there in my $1,000 tuxedo surrounded by flowers that cost more than most people's annual salaries, Listening to her lie directly to my face while hundreds of guests watched approvingly, I made a decision that would define the rest of our lives. If Melissa wanted to play games with my family's fortune, if she wanted to manipulate and deceive and ultimately destroy the people I loved most, then we would play games. But we would play by my rules, with weapons she couldn't imagine and strategies she would never see coming. The game had begun. The first year of their marriage was a masterpiece of deception on both sides, like a chess match played by grandmasters who understood that the real battle was taking place several moves ahead of what appeared on the board. Melissa continued to play the devoted wife with Academy Award-worthy skill, while secretly meeting with Mitchell and other conspirators to refine her exit strategy. Meanwhile, I played the doting father-in-law while systematically dismantling the financial structures that Melissa believed would make her wealthy. Every family dinner was theater, every casual conversation potentially loaded with strategic significance. Melissa would ask innocent questions about Dom's business activities, gathering intelligence while appearing to be nothing more than a supportive wife, taking interest in her husband's work. I would provide equally innocent answers, sharing just enough real information to maintain credibility, while carefully omitting the details that would have revealed the true scope of Dom's wealth and my own defensive preparations. The performance was exhausting, but necessary. One misstep, one moment of carelessness, and Melissa might realize that I'd discovered her true nature. If that happened before I was ready, she might accelerate her timeline or change her strategy in ways that could cause irreparable damage to Dom's emotional and financial well-being. You see, Melissa had made one critical error in her extensive research into our family's finances. She'd assumed that Dom's wealth was straightforward, traditional assets like stocks and bonds and real estate that could be easily identified, valued, and divided in a divorce proceeding. She'd studied his tax returns, observed his lifestyle, calculated his apparent net worth based on visible indicators. But she didn't understand how a man accumulates hundreds of millions of dollars without losing it to predators like herself. You don't build and maintain that kind of wealth by keeping it in obvious places where enemies can find it, and governments can seize it and lawyers can divide it. Every major asset Dom owned was part of an intricate web of trusts and holding companies and international entities that I'd helped him establish over the years. His name might appear on certain documents as a nominal owner or beneficiary, but the actual control and ownership were buried so deep in legal structures that it would take an army of forensic accountants years to untangle the relationships. And I held all the keys to those structures. Over the course of that first year, I began quietly moving Dom's assets into even more secure configurations, like a magician making objects disappear and reappear in impossible locations. Money flowed from accounts that Melissa knew about into accounts she'd never heard of, routed through jurisdictions with strict privacy laws and banking systems that didn't cooperate with American legal discovery processes. Stock holdings were transferred to shell companies incorporated in countries where corporate records were protected by laws that made Swiss banking secrecy look transparent. Real estate was placed in trusts with beneficiaries who existed only on paper, managed by lawyers who specialized in creating legal structures so complex that even other lawyers couldn't navigate them. It was like watching a magic trick performed in reverse, making vast amounts of wealth disappear while leaving behind the illusion that it was still there, still accessible, still vulnerable to the kind of divorce settlement Melissa was planning. But moving money was only part of my strategy. I also began building a comprehensive case against her, documenting every lie she told, every manipulation she attempted, every step in her plan to destroy my son's life. My security team installed surveillance equipment in Dom and Melissa's home, devices so sophisticated that even professional counter-surveillance specialists would have difficulty detecting them. Every phone call Melissa made was recorded through equipment that could penetrate encryption and bypass security measures. Every meeting with Mitchell or her other conspirators was photographed by investigators using telephoto lenses and advanced tracking technology. Every financial transaction, every research activity, every moment of her real personality breaking through her carefully maintained facade was captured and cataloged. By their first wedding anniversary, I had accumulated enough evidence to destroy her in any court in the country. But I still harbored hope that Dom would see through her deception on his own, that love would give way to wisdom before irreversible damage was done. Instead, Dom told me they were trying to have children. The thought of Melissa bearing Dom's children, of her using innocent babies as weapons in her war against our family, of her gaining access to the next generation of Castellano wealth through motherhood, was absolutely unacceptable. Children would complicate any legal response exponentially, giving her powerful leverage in custody battles and emotional manipulation that could last for decades. That's when I realized the waiting was over. It was time to force her hand, to accelerate the timeline before she could establish herself even more firmly in Dom's life and our family's future. I began making subtle changes to Dom's apparent financial situation, creating small inconveniences that would seem like normal banking irregularities to him, but would send alarm signals to someone who was monitoring his wealth as carefully as Melissa was. A credit card that was mysteriously declined at an expensive restaurant. A wire transfer that took longer than expected to process, requiring several phone calls to resolve. Bank statements that showed slightly less available cash than previous months, with explanations about market volatility and temporary liquidity issues. When Melissa asked Dom about these irregularities, he shrugged them off as the kind of minor administrative problems that occasionally affected wealthy people's financial accounts. Banks made mistakes, markets fluctuated, complex investment structures sometimes created delays in accessing funds, nothing worth worrying about. But I knew Melissa was paying attention with the focused intensity of a predator, sensing that her prey might be escaping. I knew she was getting nervous, wondering if Dom's wealth was as secure and accessible as she'd believed. I knew she was probably pressuring Mitchell to accelerate their timeline, to move forward with divorce proceedings before any potential financial problems became more serious. The private investigator I had monitoring her movements reported that her meetings with Mitchell were becoming more frequent and more urgent. According to bank records I'd obtained through discreet channels, records that would never be admissible in court but were invaluable for intelligence purposes, she was also quietly accumulating cash, making small withdrawals from her own accounts, and stashing money in various locations. She was preparing for war, gathering resources for what she expected would be an expensive and protracted legal battle. What she didn't realize was that I'd already won the war before she'd even recognized that one was being fought. Everything was building toward a confrontation. The only question was whether she would make the first move, or I would be forced to reveal my hand directly. Either way, the performance was approaching its final act, and I was confident that the audience would find the conclusion both surprising and satisfying. The answer came on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 18 months after their wedding, when the autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves and the promise of winter's approach. Dom left early that morning for what he believed was a routine business trip to Los Angeles, a 3-day excursion to evaluate renewable energy opportunities in California's Central Valley. In reality, the trip was entirely unnecessary from a business perspective. I'd created the opportunity by suggesting he meet with potential investors who were actually associates of mine, people who would provide legitimate meetings while keeping Dom safely away from New York, while the final phase of my plan unfolded. Melissa thought she had 3 days of privacy, 3 days to execute whatever final preparations she needed to make before launching her assault on our family's wealth. She probably planned to meet with Mitchell, to review legal documents, to finalize strategies and timelines and contingency plans. Instead, she had 3 days to discover that everything she thought she knew about her husband's fortune was an elaborate illusion, and that she'd been playing a game against an opponent who was several moves ahead of her at every stage. I positioned myself in the lobby of Manhattan Trust Savings at exactly 9:47 a.m. on that Tuesday morning, hiding behind a copy of the Wall Street Journal while actually monitoring the bank's entrance through carefully positioned mirrors and my peripheral vision. The building was one of those old-school financial institutions that radiated stability and tradition, with marble floors and bronze fixtures and an atmosphere that whispered of old money and older secrets. Melissa arrived at 9:52 a.m., dressed in an expensive black business suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it could house sensitive legal documents. She moved with the confident stride of someone who believed she was about to become extraordinarily wealthy, her heels clicking against the marble floor with a rhythm that sounded almost like a countdown. She approached the private banking section with the kind of assured manner that comes from months of careful planning and preparation. This was her moment, the culmination of nearly 2 years of patient manipulation and strategic positioning. In her mind, she was about to access accounts containing tens of millions of dollars, money that would become partially hers within months through a carefully orchestrated divorce settlement. I watched her speak to the private banker, a distinguished gentleman in his 50s who specialized in handling the affairs of New York's wealthiest families. I watched her present what I assumed were legal documents, probably powers of attorney or other authorizations that she believed would give her access to Dom's financial information. What followed was a masterclass in the slow dawning of horror. The banker's expression changed gradually from professional courtesy to confusion to something approaching alarm. He made phone call after phone call, each conversation apparently delivering worse news than the last. I could see Melissa's confident posture beginning to erode as minutes stretched into nearly an hour, her hands starting to fidget with her briefcase handles, her foot beginning to tap against the marble floor with increasing anxiety. Then I watched her face go completely white when the banker finally explained that the account she was inquiring about contained less than $50,000 combined. Not 50 million, 50,000, less money than she probably had in her own personal checking account. The meeting lasted 47 agonizing minutes. When Melissa finally emerged from the private banking area, she looked like she'd received news of a terminal diagnosis. Her carefully applied makeup was smudged around her eyes, her hands were visibly shaking, and her previously perfect posture had collapsed into something that suggested physical illness. She didn't notice me as she rushed past my position near the newspapers, too absorbed in her own shock and panic to be aware of her surroundings. But I saw her clearly, the moment when a predator realized she'd been hunting something far more dangerous than herself, the instant when supreme confidence transformed into desperate fear. That afternoon, driven by what I can only imagine was increasingly frantic disbelief, she visited 3 more financial institutions where Dom supposedly maintained accounts: Chase Private Banking, Goldman Sachs Private Wealth Management, and Citibank's exclusive family office services. The story was identical at each location. The accounts existed, but they contained minimal balances. The investment portfolios she'd expected to find had been liquidated months earlier. The real estate holdings she'd researched had been transferred to entities that claimed no knowledge of her identity or legal standing. From Melissa's perspective, her husband's entire fortune had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind only empty accounts and bewildered bank officers who seemed as surprised as she was by the absence of assets they'd expected to find. By evening, she was sitting in Harrison Mitchell's office on the 42nd floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, and this time my surveillance team had managed to position listening devices close enough to capture their conversation. The audio quality was excellent, clear enough that I could hear the desperation in Melissa's voice as she described the day's discoveries to her attorney. What I heard confirmed everything I'd suspected about her character while revealing additional layers of evil that made my blood run cold with rage. She wasn't just planning to divorce Dom and claim half his assets in a straightforward settlement negotiation. She'd been methodically collecting information about his business practices, looking for anything she could twist into evidence of fraud, tax evasion, or other illegal activities that would justify criminal prosecution. She'd been cultivating relationships with his competitors, his disgruntled employees, anyone who might have grievances that could be weaponized against him. She'd been building a comprehensive case designed not just to enrich herself, but to destroy Dom's reputation, send him to prison, and leave him emotionally and financially ruined for the rest of his life. The woman my son had married, the woman who shared his bed and his secrets and his dreams of the future, wasn't just a sophisticated con artist. She was a sociopath who derived genuine pleasure from the complete destruction of her victims' lives. But as I listened to her panic-stricken conversation with Mitchell, describing how Dom's assets had mysteriously disappeared and demanding that he find some legal mechanism to recover the missing wealth. I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. The pure, undiluted satisfaction of a perfectly executed plan reaching its intended conclusion. For the first time since she'd entered our family, Melissa Hartford was exactly where she belonged. Desperate, powerless, and completely at the mercy of forces she couldn't understand or control. Mitchell advised her to remain calm, to give him time to trace the missing assets through legal channels and forensic accounting methods. He suggested that Dom might have detected her intentions somehow and moved his money preemptively, or that there might be family trusts or other structures she hadn't discovered during her initial research. But I knew Melissa wouldn't wait patiently for Mitchell to work through legal channels. She was a person of action, someone who always maintained multiple contingency plans and backup strategies. I was curious to see what those alternatives looked like, how she would respond when her primary approach had been completely neutralized. I didn't have to wait long to find out. The next morning, she called her supposed job to report that she was feeling ill and wouldn't be able to come to work. Instead of staying home to recover, she drove north to Connecticut, to our family estate, claiming she wanted to discuss plans for Dom's upcoming 32nd birthday party. What she actually wanted was to search my private study for documents that might explain where Dom's money had gone, hoping to find records of offshore accounts or international transfers or other evidence of the asset protection strategies I'd implemented. What she found instead was me, sitting behind my antique mahogany desk in the book-lined study that had been the nerve center of my business empire for 3 decades, waiting for her with the patience of a spider who knows exactly when the fly will arrive at the web. I'd dismissed the household staff for the day, sending them home with full pay and instructions not to return until the following morning. The 47-room mansion was empty except for the 2 of us, its imported marble halls and hand-carved woodwork serving as the stage for a conversation that had been building for nearly 2 years. She tried to maintain her facade at first, slipping effortlessly into the role of the concerned wife worried about her husband's mysterious financial difficulties. Her voice carried just the right note of anxiety mixed with confusion as she asked whether I might know why Dom's bank account seemed to be showing incorrect balances. Perhaps there was some kind of systematic error in the banking computer systems, she suggested, or maybe a clerical mistake that had affected multiple institutions simultaneously. Her performance was flawless, as always. The slight tremor in her hands could have been attributed to worry rather than fear. The way she avoided direct eye contact might have seemed like respectful deference to an elder rather than the inability to look directly at someone she'd been systematically deceiving. Even her choice of clothing, a simple navy dress with minimal jewelry, projected the image of a woman too concerned about her husband's welfare to worry about her appearance. I let her perform for almost 10 minutes, responding to her questions with non-committal murmurs and concerned nods, playing the role of the puzzled patriarch trying to make sense of inexplicable financial irregularities. I watched her grow increasingly frustrated as I failed to provide the information she desperately needed, watched her carefully controlled facade begin to show hairline cracks under the pressure of her growing desperation. Finally, when I judged that she'd exhausted her prepared script and was beginning to improvise, I leaned back in my leather chair and spoke the words that ended her performance forever. I know exactly where Dom's money is, Melissa. I moved it myself. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The mask of the loving, concerned wife didn't just slip, it shattered completely, like safety glass struck by a hammer. What emerged from behind that carefully maintained disguise was something cold and predatory, and utterly without conscience. Her voice changed first, becoming harder and more calculating, losing the soft warmth she'd always used when speaking to family members. Her posture shifted from vulnerable to aggressive, her shoulders squaring as she leaned forward in her chair like a fighter preparing for combat. Even her facial features seemed different, as if the muscles themselves had rearranged into a more natural configuration that revealed the real person underneath. This was Melissa's true self, and the real Melissa was genuinely frightening. She didn't bother denying my accusations or attempting to maintain her cover story. Instead, she launched into a detailed explanation of exactly what she planned to do to destroy Dom's life, speaking with the calm professionalism of someone discussing a business plan rather than the systematic destruction of another human being. She would file for divorce and claim that Dom had hidden assets to avoid paying a fair settlement, she explained, her green eyes glittering with something that might have been anticipation. She would go to federal authorities with carefully fabricated evidence of tax evasion and financial crimes, forcing expensive legal battles that would drain Dom's resources even if the charges were eventually dropped. She would contact every business partner, every client, every professional relationship Dom had cultivated over the years, planting seeds of doubt about his integrity and reliability. She would systematically destroy his reputation, his business relationships, and his future earning potential. She would make him unemployable in any legitimate industry and ensure that his name became synonymous with scandal and corruption. She would turn his friends against him, his colleagues against him, and if possible, his family against him. And she would do all of this while positioning herself as the innocent victim of a manipulative husband who had deceived her about his wealth and character. Unless, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting, you return every penny you've stolen and pay me an additional $10 million to disappear quietly. I had to admire the sheer audacity of the proposal. Even caught red-handed, even completely outmaneuvered, even sitting in my own study surrounded by security cameras and recording equipment that were documenting her every word, she was still trying to negotiate from a position of strength. It took genuine sociopathic confidence to attempt extortion while being actively exposed as a fraud. I asked her what made her think she had any leverage left to negotiate with. That's when her smile returned. Not the warm, loving expression she'd perfected for Dom, but something sharp and predatory that belonged on the face of a different species entirely. That's when she pulled out her phone and began scrolling through a series of photographs that made my chest tighten with a mixture of anger and grudging professional respect. Pictures of Dom in Los Angeles, entering the Beverly Hills Hotel with a woman who wasn't his wife. Of course, I knew exactly who the woman was, Isabella Rodriguez, a renewable energy consultant Dom had been working with on a major solar project in northern Mexico. Their meeting was purely professional, a continuation of technical discussions they'd been having for months about grid integration challenges and regulatory compliance issues. But the photographs had been carefully framed and edited to suggest something entirely different. A casual observer, looking at those images, would naturally assume that Dom was having an extramarital affair, engaging in exactly the kind of behavior that would justify a vindictive divorce settlement and provide public relations cover for Melissa's legal attacks. She'd been planning this nuclear option for months, I realized. She'd hired photographers to follow Dom on business trips, waiting patiently for situations that could be misrepresented and manipulated. She'd been building an insurance policy, something she could use to destroy Dom's reputation, even if her financial schemes failed completely. The level of premeditation was staggering. This wasn't opportunistic gold digging. This was a military-style campaign with multiple phases, backup plans, and contingency strategies designed to maximize damage regardless of how Dom responded to her initial attacks. But as I studied those photographs on her phone screen, I realized something that Melissa hadn't fully considered. She was still thinking like a predator hunting an isolated victim, someone who could be attacked without consequences because he had no protection beyond his own resources. She didn't understand that Dom wasn't isolated. He was part of something larger and more powerful than himself, protected by connections and resources that she couldn't comprehend. He was part of the Castellano family. I stood up from behind my desk and walked to the tall windows that overlooked our estate's formal gardens, where October sunlight filtered through ancient oak trees that had been planted by my grandfather nearly a century ago. Outside, the world looked peaceful and orderly, but I knew that appearances could be deceiving. I'd spent 73 years learning to see past surfaces to the darker realities that lurked beneath. I told Melissa that her photographs were certainly interesting, but that they revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how power actually operates in the real world. She thought she was playing chess, moving pieces around a board according to established rules that favored aggression and deception. But we weren't playing chess. We were playing a game she'd never even heard of, with rules she couldn't begin to comprehend. Then I introduced her to the concept of mutually assured destruction, I opened my laptop and began playing a video that my security team had compiled over the past 18 months. Hours of footage from the cameras I'd had installed in Dom and Melissa's home, edited together to create a comprehensive documentary of her deception. The video showed her meeting with Mitchell, researching Dom's business partners on the internet, making phone calls to people who were obviously helping her plan his destruction. But the most damaging footage was from their bedroom, where Melissa had spent countless hours going through Dom's personal papers while he slept beside her, photographing documents and making copies of files she had no legal right to access. The images showed her carefully searching through his desk drawers, his closet, his briefcase, treating their shared home like an enemy intelligence installation that needed to be systematically compromised. In New York State, what Melissa had done constituted multiple felonies, including criminal invasion of privacy, theft of confidential business information, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The penalties for those crimes included substantial prison time, especially when committed as part of an ongoing criminal enterprise. But the video wasn't just evidence of criminal behavior. It was a window into Melissa's soul, revealing the calculating coldness with which she'd approached every aspect of her relationship with Dom. There was no moment of genuine affection, no instance of authentic emotion, no evidence that she'd ever seen him as anything more than a target to be exploited. The woman Dom loved didn't exist. She'd never existed. She was a character Melissa had created to serve her purposes, as fictional as any role played by a professional actress. The video was already in the hands of the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, I explained, along with copies of all the other evidence I'd gathered documenting her systematic fraud. Federal investigators were also reviewing the material, since Melissa's pattern of behavior across multiple states potentially constituted wire fraud, mail fraud, and violations of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. But I was prepared to make all of those legal problems disappear to ensure that the video was never seen by prosecutors or juries or the media if she agreed to my terms. She would divorce Dom quietly and amicably, seeking no financial settlement beyond what she'd brought to the marriage, which, as we both knew, was essentially nothing. She would sign comprehensive confidentiality agreements preventing her from ever discussing the Castellano family in any public forum. She would leave New York permanently and never attempt to contact any member of our family again. In exchange, I would give her $100,000 in cash, enough to start over somewhere else with a clean slate, and I would ensure that the criminal charges were never filed and the video was never released. She had 24 hours to decide. The silence that followed my offer stretched for nearly 5 minutes, long enough that I began to wonder if she was experiencing some kind of psychological breakdown. She stared at my laptop screen where the video had paused on an image of her photographing Dom's private correspondence, her face cycling through a range of emotions I'd never seen her display before. Finally, she looked up at me with something that might have been respect mixed with genuine fear. "You're not just some rich old man, are you?" she said quietly. "No," I replied. "I'm not." She gathered her purse and stood to leave, moving with the mechanical precision of someone operating on autopilot. At the doorway of my study, she paused and looked back at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. "He's lucky to have you as a father," she said. Then she was gone, her heels clicking across the marble foyer as she made her way to the front entrance and disappeared from our lives forever. The next 24 hours passed in complete silence. No phone calls, no visits, no attempts at negotiation or counter-proposals. I began to wonder if Melissa had simply run, taken whatever money she had accessible and disappeared into whatever underground network people like her used when their operations failed catastrophically. Then, at 11:47 p.m. on Wednesday evening, my private phone rang. "I accept your terms," she said without preamble. The divorce was finalized 6 weeks later through a process so efficient and amicable that their attorney seemed genuinely surprised by how smoothly everything proceeded. Dom was devastated naturally, not by the financial aspects, which he barely seemed to notice, but by what he perceived as the sudden collapse of a relationship he'd believed was perfect. He handled the emotional trauma with the dignity and resilience I'd tried to instill in him throughout his life, throwing himself into his work and traveling extensively while he processed the loss. He asked me several times if I understood why Melissa had suddenly wanted to end their marriage, and I told him what I believed was the truth, that some people are fundamentally incapable of genuine love, and that he was fortunate to have discovered this before children were involved. I never told him about the money I'd moved or the evidence I'd gathered or the deal I'd negotiated with his ex-wife. As far as Dom knew, his fortune had been temporarily tied up in complex international investment vehicles that had simply taken time to mature and become accessible again. When I quietly returned his assets to more conventional accounts over the following months, he assumed it was just the normal ebb and flow of sophisticated wealth management. Melissa kept her end of our bargain with scrupulous precision. She left New York within 2 weeks of the divorce finalization and, according to periodic reports from my investigators, eventually settled in Phoenix, Arizona, where she got a job at a legitimate marketing firm under her real name. For the first time in over a decade, she appeared to be living an honest life, working regular hours and maintaining what seemed to be genuine friendships with her colleagues. I thought that was the end of the story. I thought I'd successfully neutralized a threat to my family and perhaps even saved Melissa from a life of escalating criminality that would have eventually led to prison or worse. I was catastrophically wrong. 3 years later, on a gray November morning when the first snow of winter was beginning to dust the windows of my Connecticut office, my head of security received a phone call that changed everything I thought I understood about the forces that had threatened our family. Detective Maria Santos of the Phoenix Police Department was trying to reach me regarding a case involving a woman named Melissa Kowalski, who had apparently been using multiple identities during her time in Arizona. The detective's voice carried the kind of weary professionalism that comes from dealing with too many cases and not enough answers. Melissa was dead. According to the preliminary police report, she'd been found in her modest apartment by concerned co-workers after failing to show up at the marketing firm where she'd been employed for 2 years. The cause of death appeared to be a drug overdose, specifically, a combination of fentanyl and benzodiazepines that had shut down her respiratory system while she slept. But there were enough irregularities at the scene that detectives were treating it as a possible homicide, rather than a straightforward overdose. Her apartment showed no signs of forced entry, but several items appeared to be missing, including her laptop computer and several boxes of personal documents. More troubling, toxicology tests revealed that the drugs in her system weren't consistent with her known medical history or the prescription medications found in her bathroom. The reason Detective Santos had contacted me was that my business card had been found in Melissa's purse, along with what appeared to be a sealed letter addressed to the Castellano family, in handwriting that had been confirmed as hers through comparison with employment records. I took the next available flight to Phoenix. The letter was typed on plain white paper, 3 pages of single-spaced text that contained information I still struggle to fully process, even now, 5 years after reading it for the first time. It began with an apology, not for what she'd done to Dom and our family, but for what she was about to reveal about the forces that had been using her. Melissa hadn't been working alone. Everything she'd done, the extensive research into Dom's background, the strategic approach to their relationship, the network of professional contacts that had helped her access confidential information about our family, had been orchestrated by a sophisticated organization with resources that went far beyond what any individual con artist could access. Someone with connections to financial institutions, law enforcement agencies, and government offices had been feeding her intelligence and supporting her operation from the very beginning. Someone who had specifically targeted the Castellano family for reasons that had nothing to do with simple monetary gain. The letter contained names, dates, financial records, and photographs that painted a picture of a conspiracy that made my blood run cold. Politicians I'd donated to, judges who'd ruled on cases involving my businesses, federal agents I'd considered allies, all part of a network that had been systematically targeting wealthy families like mine for what appeared to be a combination of wealth redistribution and political control. Melissa had been recruited while she was still in her early 20s, trained in techniques of psychological manipulation and financial intelligence gathering that went far beyond anything available to ordinary criminals. Her previous victims hadn't been random targets. They'd been specifically chosen based on their political affiliations, their business relationships, and their potential value to the organization's long-term objectives. The attack on Dom had been just one small piece of a much larger puzzle, a puzzle that involved dozens of families across multiple states and hundreds of millions of dollars in assets that had been systematically transferred from their legitimate owners to accounts controlled by the conspiracy. But Melissa had made a critical error in her relationship with the organization. She'd kept copies of everything, every meeting, every phone call, every transaction, every order she'd received from her handlers. She'd been building an insurance policy, evidence she could use to protect herself if the operation ever went wrong or if her controllers decided she knew too much to remain alive. According to the letter, she'd become increasingly uncomfortable with the organization's methods as she'd gotten older and witnessed the complete destruction of several of her targets' lives. The operation that had initially been presented to her as a kind of Robin Hood activity, taking money from the corrupt rich and redistributing it to more worthy causes, had revealed itself to be something far darker and more personally destructive. When she'd tried to negotiate her way out of the organization after the failed operation against Dom, she'd been told that retirement wasn't an option. She knew too much about too many ongoing operations to be allowed to simply walk away and live a quiet life in Phoenix. So she'd started documenting everything, creating a comprehensive record of the organization's structure, methods, and targets. She'd been planning to take her evidence to federal authorities, but she'd wanted to warn the families who were still being targeted before she exposed the entire network. The letter included detailed information about ongoing operations against other wealthy families, about planned attacks on our business interests that were already in motion, about corruption that reached into the highest levels of federal law enforcement and regulatory agencies. It read like something from a paranoid thriller novel, except that every claim was supported by documentation that proved its accuracy. Melissa had died before she could deliver her evidence to the authorities or complete her warnings to the targeted families. But she'd managed to mail copies of everything to several people, including me, hoping that someone would have the resources and determination to continue the fight she'd started. The package she'd sent included not just the letter, but multiple hard drives containing gigabytes of financial records, surveillance footage, recorded phone calls, and other evidence that documented the conspiracy in exhaustive detail. It was a treasure trove of intelligence that would have been invaluable to federal prosecutors, if federal prosecutors could be trusted not to be part of the conspiracy themselves. I spent the next year quietly investigating the claims in Melissa's posthumous letter, using resources and connections that I'd built over 5 decades in business. What I discovered confirmed my worst fears about the scope and sophistication of the network she'd described. We weren't dealing with common criminals or even traditional organized crime. We were dealing with something that combined elements of corporate espionage, political manipulation, and systematic wealth redistribution on a scale that would have been unimaginable even a generation ago. A network that had infiltrated legitimate institutions and used the authority of government agencies to provide cover for what amounted to legalized theft on a massive scale. The attack on Dom had been just one operation in a campaign that involved dozens of families and hundreds of millions of dollars. Families who'd built their wealth through legitimate business activities were being systematically destroyed by adversaries who viewed their success as evidence of corruption that justified any response. I could have taken Melissa's evidence to federal authorities, but her documentation made it clear that significant portions of federal law enforcement had been compromised. I could have gone to the media, but who would have believed such an incredible story without independent verification that might have taken years to obtain? I could have simply increased our family's security measures and hoped to avoid future attacks, but that would have left other innocent families vulnerable to the same predators who had targeted us. Instead, I made a decision that has defined the last 4 years of my life. I decided to fight back. Using the intelligence Melissa had provided, I began identifying and neutralizing threats to families like ours with the systematic precision of someone who'd learned strategy and tactics in the unforgiving arena of international business. It was delicate work that required resources most people couldn't access and connections that had taken decades to cultivate. It was also dangerous work that put me in direct conflict with adversaries who didn't hesitate to use violence when more subtle methods failed to achieve their objectives. But it was necessary work, because the alternative was allowing the network Melissa had exposed to continue destroying lives and families for profit and political control. The war I found myself fighting was unlike anything I'd encountered in 5 decades of business competition. These weren't rival companies trying to gain market share or hostile takeover specialists attempting to acquire undervalued assets. These were ideological enemies who viewed successful families like mine as inherently corrupt, regardless of how we'd earned our wealth or what we did with it. They believed that large accumulations of private wealth were fundamentally unjust, and that any method used to redistribute that wealth was morally justified. They operated with the fervor of religious crusaders, combined with the sophisticated methods of intelligence agencies, making them far more dangerous than conventional criminals, who were motivated purely by personal gain. Over the past 4 years, I've used Melissa's intelligence to identify and disrupt dozens of operations targeting families across the country. Some I've been able to warn discreetly, providing enough information to help them protect themselves without revealing the source of my knowledge. Others I've had to assist more directly, using financial and legal resources to neutralize threats before they could cause irreparable damage. It's been exhausting work that has aged me far more than my 73 years would suggest. I should be retired, playing golf at exclusive clubs, traveling with my wife, spoiling my grandchildren. Instead, I spend my days tracking money flows through international banking systems, analyzing patterns in seemingly random business failures and trying to stay one step ahead of an enemy that hides behind legitimate institutions. But it's been necessary work, and I believe it's been effective. The network Melissa exposed has suffered significant disruption over the past 4 years, with several of its key operatives exposed and prosecuted, and numerous operations shut down before they could achieve their objectives. Dom doesn't know about any of this shadow war I've been fighting. As far as he's concerned, his ex-wife was simply a sophisticated gold digger who got caught and disappeared. He's remarried now to a wonderful woman named Catherine, someone who genuinely loves him for who he is, rather than what he owns. They have 2 beautiful children, my grandchildren, and Dom has never been happier or more successful. But I know the truth that Melissa died trying to reveal. I know that her death wasn't the end of our story. It was the beginning of a conflict that most people don't even realize is being fought. A war between families who've built something worth protecting, and ideological enemies who believe that private success is evidence of public corruption. I'm 73 years old now, and I won't be able to continue this fight forever. But I've been training others, sharing Melissa's intelligence with people who have the resources and determination to carry on the work when I'm no longer able to do it myself. The network that killed Melissa is still out there, still recruiting new operatives, still targeting successful families for destruction. But they no longer operate with the impunity they once enjoyed. They know that their activities are being monitored, their methods are being exposed, and their victims are fighting back with resources they never anticipated. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choices in how I handled Melissa's threat to our family. If I'd confronted Dom directly from the beginning, if I'd forced him to see who she really was before they were married, maybe she would never have gotten close enough to our family to learn what she ultimately died trying to reveal. Maybe she'd still be alive today, living honestly in some distant city, having chosen a different path when she realized the true nature of the organization that had recruited her. But then I remember the cold calculation in her eyes when her mask finally came off, the detailed plans she'd made to destroy not just Dom's wealth but his freedom and his future. I remember that she'd chosen to be part of something evil, and that choices have consequences that extend beyond the individual making them. Melissa Hartford made a deal with devils who proved to be more dangerous than she realized. When she finally understood the true nature of what she'd become part of, when she tried to extract herself and warn the families who were still being targeted, Those same devils decided she knew too much to be allowed to live. But before she died, she gave us the intelligence we needed to fight back against the system she'd served. And we've been using that intelligence to protect other families, to disrupt ongoing operations, and to ensure that the people who killed her understand that their actions have consequences. The war isn't over. It may never be completely over, because there will always be ideological extremists who view private success as evidence of public corruption, who believe that any method used to redistribute wealth is morally justified. But at least now we know our enemy. At least now we understand their methods and their objectives. At least now when someone targets the people we love, they discover that the families they're attacking have resources and determination and connections they never imagined. At least now, the predators sometimes become the prey. If there's a lesson in this story, it's that the world is far more dangerous and more complex than most people realize. Evil often wears beautiful faces and speaks with charming voices and hides behind legitimate institutions. Love can make us blind to threats that should be obvious, and trust can be weaponized by those who understand how to exploit it. But the story also demonstrates that family loyalty is worth fighting for, that some things are more important than personal comfort or peace of mind, and that sometimes protecting the people you love requires making choices that will haunt you for the rest of your life. Dom is safe now. His children are safe. Catherine is safe. The Castellano family endures, stronger than ever, because we learned to recognize our enemies and fight back with everything we have. But somewhere out there, in anonymous office buildings and government agencies and corporate boardrooms, the network that killed Melissa is still operating, still recruiting new operatives like she once was, still targeting successful families for systematic destruction. They think they're fighting a righteous war against corruption and inequality. They believe their cause justifies any method, any deception, any level of personal destruction they choose to inflict on their targets. They're about to learn that the families they've been hunting are no longer helpless prey, that we've been watching them as carefully as they've been watching us, that we have resources they can't imagine and patience they can't comprehend, and that we're done being victims. So here's my message to anyone listening who thinks they can target innocent families for ideological reasons, who believes that private success justifies public destruction, who hides behind government authority while engaging in systematic theft and manipulation. We see you. We know who you are. We have your names, your methods, your targets, your financial networks. We have evidence of your crimes and documentation of your conspiracies. We have survived your attacks and learned from your methods. And now we're coming for you. Not because we want revenge, though you certainly deserve it. Not because we enjoy conflict, though we'll engage in it when necessary. But because protecting our families and communities from predators like you is the most important work any of us can do. The age of hunting successful families like defenseless prey is over. The age of consequences has begun. And if this story resonates with you, if you've suspected that powerful forces are working to destroy successful families through deception rather than honest competition, if you've wondered why so many wealthy people seem to suffer sudden, inexplicable reversals of fortune, then you need to understand what's really happening. Share this video with other families who might be targeted. Subscribe to this channel to stay informed about ongoing threats. Leave comments about your own experiences with suspicious approaches or unexplained financial problems. Because the only way we win this war is by standing together, sharing intelligence, and refusing to be victims of those who view our success as evidence of our corruption. The Castellano family has learned to fight back. We've survived attacks that were designed to destroy us completely, and we've used that experience to help other families protect themselves from similar threats. But this fight is bigger than any one family, no matter how wealthy or well-connected. It requires all of us to recognize that our success makes us targets, that our prosperity makes us enemies of those who believe private wealth is inherently unjust. It requires us to understand that sometimes the price of protecting what we've built is eternal vigilance against those who would take it from us. The question isn't whether you'll be targeted. If you're successful, you already are. The question is whether you'll be ready when they come for you. We are ready. The Castellano family stands prepared to fight. Will you stand with us?